The old Stagecoach Inn had been sitting empty so long that even the weeds seemed tired of growing around it. Clara Whitmore was 23 and homeless when she bought it. No apartment. No family willing to take her in. No savings worth mentioning. Just a backpack, a county tax auction listing, and the last $10 she owned. Most people would have spent that money on a motel room, a bus ticket, or a few meals. Clara spent it on a collapsing stagecoach inn tucked into the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania. The building had once welcomed travelers crossing the countryside by horse and carriage. Now its windows were clouded with dust, its porch sagged toward the earth, and its faded sign swung gently whenever the wind found it. The county records described it as unsafe. The locals described it as forgotten. Clara described it as hers. She arrived late in the afternoon beneath a sky the color of worn silver. The gravel driveway was nearly invisible beneath grass. A pair of maple trees stood beside the inn like old guardians who had watched decades pass without visitors. Inside, the air smelled of aged wood, dry plaster, and time itself. Dust floated through narrow beams of light. A cracked front desk still stood in the lobby. Empty guest rooms lined the second floor. The kitchen remained exactly where it had been generations earlier, as though someone had simply walked away and never returned. But what nobody knew was that somewhere beneath that abandoned inn, hidden beyond sight and memory, was a secret that had waited more than 60 years for the right person to find it. Clara had no idea what that secret was. She only knew that certain details did not seem to fit. A notation in an old county inventory mentioned deliveries being stored below ground. A faded maintenance record referred to a root cellar. Yet no cellar appeared on any surviving floor plan. No visible entrance existed. No resident could remember seeing one. That night, as darkness settled around the inn and the old walls creaked softly in the cooling air, Clara stood alone in the silent kitchen. Somewhere beneath her feet, something had been forgotten. And before long, she would discover that the greatest mystery in the building was not what had been left behind, but why someone had worked so hard to make sure it stayed hidden. The old floorboards seemed to hold their silence as Clara stood in the kitchen, staring at the place where the missing cellar should have been. The question lingered in her mind, but it pulled her somewhere older, somewhere far from Pennsylvania, and years before she had ever stepped inside the inn. Clara had grown up in a small Vermont town where winters arrived early and stayed longer than anyone wanted. Her mother worked at the public library on Main Street, a brick building that smelled of paper, dust, and radiator heat. While other children ran through the aisles looking for adventure stories, Clara wandered toward the shelves that nobody visited. She loved collections. Not valuable things. Not rare things. Forgotten things. She would sit cross-legged on worn carpet reading old local histories, yellowed newspaper clippings, and donated journals written by people whose names meant nothing to anyone anymore. She was fascinated by the simple fact that ordinary lives could disappear so completely. One afternoon when she was 8 years old, she found a box of postcards that had been donated by the family of a deceased schoolteacher. The postcards had traveled across America decades earlier. Some contained only a few sentences. Weather updates, travel plans, greetings from strangers long gone. Clara spent hours reading them. Her mother eventually found her sitting alone at a table with dozens of cards spread around her like puzzle pieces. Most children would have seen scraps of paper. Clara saw evidence that people had existed, that they had laughed somewhere, worried about something, missed someone, and left traces behind. Her mother never discouraged the habit. In fact, she quietly encouraged it. Whenever the library discarded old magazines, maps, or duplicate records, she brought them home. Together, they spent evenings at the kitchen table sorting papers into neat stacks. Her mother would tell her that every document carried a small piece of a human life. A receipt could tell a story. A letter could preserve a memory. A handwritten note could outlive the person who wrote it. Clara listened carefully because her mother spoke about these things as if they mattered deeply. When Clara turned 11, her mother took her to an abandoned railway hotel scheduled for demolition outside town. A local historical group had been cataloging artifacts before the building came down. Clara spent the entire day helping volunteers sort guest ledgers, room keys, and faded registration books. She was amazed by the names written across the pages. Thousands of travelers had passed through the hotel. Most had been forgotten. Yet for a brief moment, the old books made them visible again. That day remained with her for years, not because of the building itself, but because of what it represented, a place where countless stories had crossed paths before drifting apart. As she grew older, Clara developed a habit of carrying a notebook wherever she went. She filled page after page with observations, conversations overheard in diners, names found on gravestones, stories told by elderly neighbors sitting on porches during summer evenings. She rarely spoke much herself. She preferred listening. People often revealed surprising things when someone took the time to pay attention. Her mother became the center of that quiet world. More than anyone else, she taught Clara that lives did not need to be famous to matter. They only needed someone willing to remember them. By the time Clara reached her teenage years, she understood something she could never fully explain. Every forgotten place seemed to call to her. Every abandoned building felt less like a ruin and more like a book whose final chapters had gone unread. She did not know it then, but that small fascination would eventually guide her toward a lonely inn in rural Pennsylvania and toward a story that had been waiting decades for someone exactly like her to find it. Standing in that quiet kitchen years later, Clara could still remember the moment she realized that stories did not preserve themselves. Somebody had to do the work. Somebody had to notice what others overlooked. That understanding followed her through her late teens and into adulthood. After high school, she began volunteering at the Addison County Historical Archive, a modest brick building tucked behind the town courthouse. The archive occupied what had once been a carriage storage building in the 19th century. The wooden floors sloped slightly with age, and the shelves carried thousands of documents that few people ever requested. Clara loved it immediately. Most visitors arrived searching for family records or property deeds. Clara preferred the boxes nobody opened. She spent hours sorting uncatalogued collections, carefully unfolding brittle papers, and reading handwriting that seemed almost impossible to decipher. The archive director, a retired historian named Walter Gaines, noticed her patience. Walter was in his 70s and believed that preserving history required equal parts curiosity and stubbornness. He became an informal mentor. Instead of assigning Clara simple tasks, he taught her how to examine old structures through records. He showed her how building plans changed over decades, how additions were added without documentation, and how renovations often erased evidence of what came before. More importantly, he taught her to pay attention to inconsistencies. When a ledger described a room that no longer appeared on a floor plan, Walter encouraged questions. When inventory lists mentioned storage areas that seemed impossible based on the building dimensions, he taught her to investigate further. Small discrepancies fascinated him. Over time, they fascinated Clara as well. Walter often said that forgotten history rarely vanished completely. It usually left fingerprints. Clara learned to follow those fingerprints. During one summer project, the archive acquired records from a shuttered boarding house built in the 1880s. The building itself had been demolished years earlier, but several boxes of documents survived. Clara spent weeks organizing receipts, guest registries, supply orders, and maintenance records. While comparing records from different years, she noticed repeated references to a storage room that did not appear on surviving architectural drawings. Walter smiled when she brought it to him. He told her that old buildings often carried hidden layers created by generations of owners. Rooms were closed off. Staircases were removed. Entrances disappeared. Sometimes entire spaces survived unnoticed for decades simply because everyone assumed they were gone. That lesson stayed with her. It became more than historical curiosity. It became a way of looking at the world. Around the same time, Clara developed a second skill that would later prove equally important. The archive occasionally received damaged collections stored in damp basements, barns, and attics. Many documents arrived stained, fragile, or partially deteriorated. Walter taught her basic preservation techniques. She learned how to handle brittle paper without causing further damage. She learned methods for drying moisture-damaged records. She practiced cleaning dust and debris from old journals using soft brushes and careful movements. Most importantly, she learned how to preserve information before time erased it completely. The work required patience. Some afternoons, she spent hours restoring only a handful of pages. Yet she found satisfaction in rescuing words that might otherwise disappear. By her early 20s, Clara was working part-time at the archive while taking freelance cataloging projects for local museums and historical societies. The pay was modest, but the work suited her. She traveled throughout Vermont helping inventory forgotten collections tucked away inside churches, town halls, and family estates. Again and again she found herself entering old buildings filled with traces of people long gone. Each project reinforced the same quiet feeling she had carried since childhood. Places remembered more than people realized. Sometimes a handwritten note hidden inside a drawer revealed more truth than an official record. Sometimes an overlooked inventory list exposed an entire missing chapter of local history. Without realizing it, Clara had spent years training herself to notice absences. Missing rooms, missing names, missing stories. The skill seemed oddly specific, useful only to someone fascinated by forgotten places. Yet somewhere beyond Vermont, an old building waited with a missing space buried beneath it. And when the time finally came, Clara would recognize the signs because she had been preparing for that moment far longer than she knew. The thought lingered with Clara long after she left the archive each evening. She often wondered whether forgotten places felt lonely in the same way forgotten people did. At 21, she still believed she had time to find the answer. Life was modest, but it felt stable. She rented a small second-floor apartment above a bakery in Middlebury. The floors creaked. The windows rattled during winter storms. The radiator hissed unpredictably, yet it was hers. Every morning smelled faintly of bread rising downstairs. Every evening ended with a stack of records spread across her kitchen table and a lamp glowing beside her notebook. For a while, that felt enough. Then the small changes began. They arrived quietly, the way most important changes do. The historical archive lost funding after a county budget reduction. Hours were cut. Several preservation projects were postponed indefinitely. Temporary contracts disappeared first. Then part-time positions followed. Walter remained optimistic in public, but Clara could see the strain in his eyes. The building that had always felt permanent suddenly seemed fragile. She took additional freelance work wherever she could find it. Some months were manageable, others were not. Small museums delayed payments. Historical societies canceled projects. Expenses rose while opportunities shrank. Clara adjusted the way people always do. She skipped unnecessary purchases. She postponed replacing worn shoes. She learned how far a bag of rice could stretch when combined with patience and creativity. Even then, she never complained. Hardship was easier to tolerate than uncertainty. Uncertainty left too much room for imagination. Then Walter suffered a stroke. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. One week, he was teaching volunteers how to identify 19th-century handwriting. The next week, he was recovering in a rehabilitation facility nearly 2 hours away. The stroke was not catastrophic, but it ended his career. His family relocated him to live closer to his daughter in New Hampshire. Before leaving, he invited Clara to visit him one final time at the archive. The building felt strangely empty without his voice echoing through the aisles. Walter moved slowly, leaning on a cane. Yet his eyes remained sharp. They walked together through the storage rooms one last time. He stopped beside a shelf filled with uncatalogued collections and rested his hand on a dusty archival box. Most people think history is about the important people, he told her. It is not. It is about everyone else. The people who leave small traces behind. Somebody has to care enough to notice them. Clara nodded because she understood exactly what he meant. Walter smiled. You always noticed. Those were the last words he ever spoke to her in person. After he left, the archive changed. New administrators focused on efficiency. Volunteer programs were reduced. Preservation projects slowed. The work became increasingly administrative and less meaningful. Clara remained for another year, trying to convince herself that stability mattered more than fulfillment. Yet each month felt smaller than the one before it. Then came the notice about her apartment building. The bakery owner had sold the property to a regional developer. Renovations would begin in 90 days. All tenants were required to vacate. Clara spent weeks searching for alternatives. The timing could not have been worse. Rental prices had climbed sharply throughout the region. Every apartment she could afford had waiting lists. Every available room seemed to disappear before she arrived to view it. She stayed calm at first. Then she became worried. Then exhausted. She drove from town to town chasing possibilities that never materialized. Some landlords never returned her calls. Others politely informed her that dozens of applicants had already expressed interest. The familiar places that once anchored her life began slipping away one by one. The bakery closed during renovations. Several local institutions she had worked with reduced operations. Friends relocated for better opportunities. Familiar faces disappeared from daily routines. By the following spring, Clara found herself living temporarily in a spare room belonging to an acquaintance she barely knew. The arrangement was supposed to last a few weeks. It stretched into months. She tried to remain grateful. She paid what she could. She stayed out of the way. Yet she could feel the unspoken reality growing heavier with each passing week. She no longer belonged there. The feeling reminded her of standing in a room after a gathering had ended, knowing everyone else had already gone home. One evening she returned from a temporary cataloging assignment and found a note waiting on the kitchen counter. It was kind, thoughtful even. Her host had accepted a new job in Ohio and planned to move within 30 days. The house would be sold shortly afterward. There was no anger in the note, no conflict, just simple reality. Another door quietly closing. Clara sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time after reading it. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. The room felt unfamiliar despite the months she had spent there. She realized she had reached a point she never imagined. No permanent home, no stable job, no mentor left nearby, no clear plan. The map she had followed through adulthood had slowly dissolved beneath her feet. That night, she opened her notebook and stared at a blank page. For several minutes, she could not think of a single thing to write. Then she wrote one sentence. Somewhere there must still be a place waiting to be found. It was not much, barely more than a thought. Yet as she closed the notebook and listened to the rain beyond the glass, that small sentence remained. A fragile thread of hope stretching into darkness, leading somewhere she could not yet see. That fragile thread stayed with Clara over the following weeks. She carried it through job searches, apartment listings, and long afternoons spent at public library computers trying to imagine a future that still felt hidden from view. Most of the opportunities she found looked exactly alike. Temporary rentals, seasonal work, shared housing arrangements that solved one problem while creating another. Nothing felt permanent. Nothing felt like a place where she could finally stop drifting. One rainy afternoon, she was sitting in a library outside Rutland, scrolling through county records websites while waiting for a freelance client to return a phone call. She had no specific goal. Years of archival work had given her a habit of wandering through public databases simply to see what was there. Tax auctions, surplus property notices, historical preservation listings. Most of the entries were exactly what she expected. Vacant lots, condemned sheds, unbuildable parcels. Then a photograph stopped her. The image was grainy and slightly crooked, clearly taken by someone documenting a property rather than admiring it. Yet Clara could not look away. The building sat alone at the edge of a small Pennsylvania township. Its long front porch sagged beneath the weight of time. Tall grass surrounded the structure. The faded remains of painted lettering were still visible across a weathered signboard. Even through the poor quality photograph, she could see the proportions of the place. The broad central entrance, the long roofline, the symmetry common to 19th century inns that had once served travelers moving between distant towns. She opened the listing. The property had been acquired by the county after decades of unpaid taxes. Multiple auction attempts had failed. The structure was considered economically impractical to restore. Demolition had been discussed several times, but repeatedly postponed due to budget limitations and historical review concerns. The current minimum bid was $10. Clara read the listing once, then twice, then a third time. The accompanying description was brief. Former Stagecoach Inn. Estimated construction date, 1868. Vacant for more than 60 years. Structural deterioration present. Utilities disconnected. Sold as is. No guarantees. She enlarged the photograph. The windows appeared clouded with dust. One shutter hung crooked beside an upper-story frame. A maple tree stood near the porch, its branches reaching toward the roof as though trying to reclaim the building. Most people would have seen a liability. Clara saw something else. She saw a place that had spent decades waiting for someone to notice it. The feeling surprised her because it was not entirely rational. She knew better than anyone how easily old buildings could become impossible burdens. Yet the longer she looked at the image, the more familiar it felt. Not familiar because she had seen the inn before. Familiar because it represented everything that had drawn her since childhood. Countless travelers had once passed through those doors. Conversations had filled those rooms. Lives had intersected there before continuing in different directions. Now the building sat silent, carrying memories nobody seemed interested in preserving. Later that evening, Clara searched local historical records. She found scattered references to the inn stretching back more than a century. Freight drivers, traveling salesmen, families moving westward, community gatherings, election meetings, harvest celebrations. The building had once occupied the center of local life. Then highways changed transportation routes. Businesses moved elsewhere. The inn faded from public memory one decade at a time. By midnight, she was still reading. By 2 in the morning, she was studying county maps. By sunrise, she understood something simple and unsettling. She had spent years preserving traces of places like this after someone else discovered them. For the first time in her life, an opportunity stood before her to become part of the story instead. Clara closed her notebook, looked once more at the faded photograph, and made the decision. She would place the bid. The confirmation arrived 3 days later. Clara read the email twice before she fully believed it. The county had accepted the bid. The property was hers. For a long time, she simply sat in the library parking lot with her phone resting in her lap. Cars came and went. People carried books through the front doors. A cold breeze moved through the trees overhead. The world continued exactly as it had the hour before, yet something fundamental had shifted. The future no longer looked like a blank wall. It looked like a road. During the following week, she reduced her life to what could fit inside her aging hatchback. The process took less time than she expected. A few boxes of books, 2 suitcases, her notebooks, a lamp she had owned since college, several archival supplies she could not bring herself to leave behind. As each item found its place inside the vehicle, the room she had been borrowing grew emptier. By the final evening, only a mattress and a folding chair remained. The house felt unfamiliar without her belongings. It was as though she had already left. The next morning, she locked the door for the last time and placed the key on the kitchen counter. No ceremony, no dramatic farewell, just a quiet departure. The kind that happens every day across America when people move towards something they cannot fully explain. She began driving south before sunrise. Vermont gradually gave way to New York. The mountains softened into rolling farmland. Small towns appeared beside rivers and disappeared again behind tree-covered hills. Clara kept the radio off for most of the trip. She preferred the silence. It gave her room to think. Every few hours she stopped for gas, coffee, or a sandwich. At one roadside diner near the Pennsylvania border, an elderly waitress asked where she was headed. Clara considered giving the simple answer. Instead, she found herself smiling. "An old inn," she said. The waitress nodded as though that explained everything. "Sometimes old places need somebody," she replied before refilling Clara's coffee cup. The words stayed with her long after she returned to the highway. By afternoon, the landscape began changing again. Long ridges stretched across the horizon. Narrow valleys opened between forested hillsides. Red barns stood beside winding roads. Streams flashed silver beneath small bridges. The farther she traveled, the older everything seemed. Not abandoned, simply settled, as though the land had been telling the same stories for generations. She followed county roads that grew progressively narrower. Traffic disappeared. Cell service weakened. Towns became farther apart. Eventually, she passed through the township mentioned in the property records. A white church stood beside a general store. A row of modest houses lined the main street. An American flag moved gently above the volunteer fire station. Then even those signs of community fell behind her. The road curved through open countryside bordered by maple trees and weathered stone fences. Clara felt a nervous excitement building with every mile. For months, she had been drifting without direction. Now she was moving toward a destination that belonged to her. The afternoon light had turned golden by the time her navigation led her onto a gravel road. Dust followed behind the car. Trees closed in on both sides. Then, beyond a bend in the road, she saw it. The building stood alone against the fading sky, quiet and weathered and impossibly real. Clara eased the car to a stop and rested both hands on the steering wheel. For several seconds, she simply stared. After all the uncertainty, all the searching, all the closed doors, she was finally standing face to face with the place that had been waiting for her. For a long moment, Clara remained beside the car, listening. The countryside was quiet in a way that cities never were. Wind moved softly through the maples. Somewhere beyond the fields, a crow called once and fell silent. The inn stood ahead of her, weathered by decades of rain, snow, and forgotten seasons. It did not look abandoned so much as patient. She gathered her backpack, walked through the tall grass, and climbed the porch steps carefully. The boards groaned beneath her weight, but held firm. Up close, she could see layers of faded paint beneath the current weathered surface. Cream beneath brown, green beneath cream. The building had worn many versions of itself over the years. A brass handle remained attached to the front door, tarnished but intact. She turned it slowly. The latch clicked. The door opened inward with a long wooden sigh. Cool air drifted out to meet her. It smelled of old timber, dust, stone, and something else she could not immediately place. Not decay, not mold, simply age. The scent of a place that had been closed for a very long time. She stepped inside. Sunlight filtered through tall windows clouded by grime. Dust floated in the beams like tiny drifting stars. The entry hall opened into a large common room. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Several wooden tables remained scattered throughout the space. Their surfaces were coated in gray. Dust, but otherwise surprisingly intact. A row of pegs still lined the wall near the entrance where travelers had once hung coats and hats. Clara moved slowly through the room. Every object seemed to hold its breath. Near the fireplace, she found an iron poker resting exactly where someone had last placed it. Beside one table sat a wooden chair with one repaired leg. The repair had been done carefully, suggesting someone once valued the chair enough to save it rather than replace it. Small details like that always interested her. They revealed affection. People repaired things they cared about. She crossed into what had once been the dining room. Several shelves remained attached to the walls. Most stood empty. One still held 3 chipped ceramic plates and a cracked pitcher decorated with blue flowers. Dust covered everything evenly. No sign suggested anyone had entered recently. Yet the arrangement felt deliberate rather than chaotic. The building had not been looted. It had simply been left behind. Beyond the dining room, she found the kitchen. A large cast-iron stove occupied the center. Copper hooks hung from ceiling beams. Cabinets lined the walls. She opened each one carefully. Most were empty. One contained several handwritten inventory slips, brittle with age. She slipped them into a protective folder without examining them closely. Another cabinet held old preserving jars clouded by decades of dust. The labels had faded almost completely. She noticed that many kitchen surfaces showed signs of heavy use. Deep knife marks scarred preparation tables. Floorboards near the stove had been worn smooth by thousands of footsteps. The room carried the personality of hard work performed over many years. Later, she climbed the staircase to the second floor. Each step creaked differently. Some groaned deeply. Others produced lighter sounds. Clara found herself listening to the building as much as observing it. Old places developed voices. This one spoke in timber and settling nails. The upstairs hallway stretched the length of the structure. Guest rooms opened on both sides. She explored them one by one. Most contained simple iron bed frames, washstands, and empty wardrobes. Wallpaper peeled gently from several walls. Sunlight entered through cracked curtains and painted soft rectangles across dusty floors. In one room, she discovered a single leather glove resting inside a drawer. In another, she found a forgotten button sewn from mother of pearl. Tiny remnants of people who had passed through and disappeared. The final room at the end of the hall felt different. Not larger, but more personal. A writing desk stood beneath a window overlooking the fields. Unlike the other rooms, this one contained books. Only 6 remained. Most were local histories and travel journals. A dried fountain pen rested inside the desk drawer beside a stack of blank stationery. Clara sat briefly in the chair and looked out the window. The view stretched across rolling hills touched by late afternoon light. Whoever occupied this room had spent many hours watching travelers arrive and depart. She wondered whether they had ever imagined the building would one day stand empty. By evening, she began cleaning. Not because she intended immediate restoration, but because she wanted to understand the structure. Sweeping revealed patterns hidden beneath dust. Footpaths emerged where generations had walked. Scratches became visible along walls and door frames. Certain doors showed heavier wear than others. Some areas of the inn appeared more frequently used. As darkness approached, she lit a battery lantern and continued exploring. Near the back of the first floor, she discovered an office tucked behind the common room. A roll-top desk occupied one corner. Shelves filled another. Most papers had long since vanished, yet a few fragments remained. Receipts, supply orders, notes recording deliveries. She examined them carefully. Several mentioned produce, apples, potatoes, carrots, and preserved goods arriving in quantities larger than expected for the visible storage space. The observation caught her attention immediately. She placed the documents aside for later study. The next morning, she resumed her work. Hours passed. She opened stuck windows, cleared debris from hallways, sorted surviving papers into neat stacks. Gradually, the building revealed more of its character. It had never been elegant. It had been practical. Every room seemed designed to welcome movement. Travelers arrived, rested, shared stories, then continued onward. The inn had existed as a crossroads, a place where lives briefly intersected before diverging again. That realization stirred something deep inside her. By late afternoon, she moved back into the kitchen, carrying a broom. While sweeping beneath a long wall of shelving, she noticed something odd. The floorboards directly in front of the shelves were worn more heavily than the surrounding area. Not by ordinary foot traffic. The marks formed parallel grooves running several feet across the floor. She knelt for a closer look. The grooves appeared old, very old, yet they remained visible beneath the dust, as though something substantial had repeatedly moved back and forth in exactly the same location. Clara followed the marks to the base of the shelving unit. The shelves themselves looked original, yet when she examined the surrounding wall, subtle differences appeared. The boards behind the shelves did not match neighboring sections perfectly. The nails were slightly newer. The wood coloration was inconsistent. Nothing dramatic, just enough to suggest alteration. She sat back on her heels and studied the wall in silence. For the first time since arriving, the building seemed to be offering an answer to a question she had not yet fully asked. Somewhere inside this inn, a piece of its story did not fit. And the deeper she looked at the strange marks hidden beneath years of dust, the more certain she became that something important had once stood exactly where those shelves stood now. Clara remained kneeling on the kitchen floor long after the afternoon light had begun to fade. The irregularities were too deliberate to ignore. She fetched a flashlight, a pry bar, and a notebook, then returned to the shelving unit. Up close, the differences became even more apparent. The surrounding wall boards were rough-cut chestnut darkened by age. The section hidden behind the shelves used slightly different lumber. Not modern, but newer than the rest. Someone had altered this area decades after the building was first constructed. The grooves in the floors suddenly made sense. The shelves had not always been fixed in place. At one time they had moved. Carefully, Clara emptied the remaining jars and debris from the shelves. Dust rose into the lantern light. Cobwebs stretched between corners untouched for generations. When she pushed against the unit, nothing happened. The wood had settled over time. She tried again with more force. A faint movement answered. Not much. Less than an inch. But enough. Her pulse quickened. Working slowly, she continued. Bit by bit the heavy shelving shifted aside. Beneath years of dust a narrow outline emerged in the floorboards. A rectangular wooden hatch. Clara sat back in silence. She had spent years studying forgotten places, yet the sight still felt unreal. Someone had hidden this entrance deliberately, not boarded over, not abandoned accidentally. Hidden. She brushed away dirt with trembling hands and lifted the iron ring embedded in the wood. The hinges resisted at first. Then a deep creak echoed through the room. Cool air drifted upward from below, carrying the scent of stone and earth. A staircase descended into darkness. The next morning she waited for daylight before continuing. Practical caution won over excitement. She packed flashlights, spare batteries, gloves, and a camera. Then she opened the hatch fully and descended. The stone steps were narrow but stable. Moisture glistened on the walls. The air grew cooler with every step. At the bottom, she entered a large root cellar extending beneath much of the building. Rows of wooden shelves lined the walls. Empty crates sat stacked in corners. Most showed signs of age, water staining, and insect damage. Yet the room itself remained remarkably intact. Clara moved slowly, documenting everything. Several shelves still contained rusted canning equipment. A few broken preserving jars remained scattered across the floor. The space had clearly served its intended purpose for many years. Yet something felt unusual. The cellar was larger than expected, significantly larger. According to the dimensions of the building above, part of the room extended beneath an area where no cellar should exist. Clara followed the wall carefully. At the far end, she discovered evidence of repair work. Mortar coloration changed. Stone patterns shifted subtly. Once again, something did not fit. She examined the area for nearly an hour before noticing a narrow gap hidden behind a stack of collapsed crates. The crates crumbled when touched. Their wood had softened with age and moisture. Behind them stood a small wooden door built directly into the stonework. The door was plain, unmarked, barely visible. Its iron latch had rusted almost solid. Clara stared at it for a long moment. Then she carefully worked the latch free. The hinges groaned as the door opened inward. Beyond it lay a second chamber, smaller, drier, better protected from moisture than the rest of the cellar. Unlike the storage area outside, this room had been organized intentionally. Wooden trunks sat against one wall. Shelves held document boxes wrapped in oilcloth. Everything wore the marks of time. Dust covered every surface. Leather straps had cracked. Paper labels had faded. Yet someone had taken extraordinary care to preserve what was here. Clara approached the nearest trunk and opened it slowly. Inside were bundles of letters tied with cloth ribbon that had long since lost its color. The envelopes were yellowed and brittle. Ink had faded to soft brown. Some carried postmarks dating back more than a century. Others had no addresses at all. She opened one carefully. It contained a letter written by a traveling salesman describing his journey west and thanking the innkeeper for her kindness during a snowstorm. Another came from a widow traveling to live with relatives after losing her husband. Another described a young teacher moving across the state to begin a new life. The letters continued. Dozens, then hundreds. Clara opened additional containers. More correspondence, journals, guest notebooks, personal accounts, receipts tucked between pages, photographs curled with age. Each object carried signs of long storage. Water stains, faded ink, torn corners repaired with old tape, mold spots carefully cleaned decades earlier. Yet the stories remained readable. Gradually a picture emerged. The inn had once been managed by a woman named Eleanor Mercer. Her name appeared repeatedly throughout the collection. At first, Clara assumed Eleanor had simply preserved business records. Then she discovered journals written in Eleanor's own hand. The entries transformed everything. Eleanor had spent decades collecting the stories of travelers who passed through the inn. Not famous people, not wealthy people, ordinary people, farmers, teachers, laborers, widows, veterans, immigrants, families moving toward uncertain futures. Whenever someone shared a meaningful story, Eleanor recorded it. When travelers wrote letters they could not carry, she saved copies. When guests left photographs behind, she preserved them. She became an unofficial keeper of lives that history rarely remembered. Clara sat on the cellar floor reading page after page. The discovery felt deeply familiar, not because she had expected it, but because it mirrored something she had carried since childhood. Eleanor had believed what Clara's mother once taught her. Ordinary lives mattered. Someone should remember them. The realization hit harder than any historical discovery she had ever made. Yet there was more. Deep inside the final trunk, she found a ledger unlike the others. Moisture had damaged portions of the cover. Several pages stuck together. Inside, Eleanor described her growing fear that the collection would be discarded after her death. The final entries explained why she created the hidden room. She had concealed the archive to protect it, to ensure future generations would not throw it away during renovations or ownership changes. The last completed page ended with a single sentence written in careful script. If these stories are ever found, let them belong to someone who understands why they matter. Clara stared at the words for a very long time. Around her sat the preserved voices of hundreds of forgotten lives. Above her stood the silent inn that had guarded them for generations. And for the first time since arriving, she understood that the discovery was not merely about what had been hidden. It was about why it had been waiting. Clara remained in the hidden chamber until the lantern battery began to fade. The silence around her felt different now. Not empty, not lonely, filled. Hundreds of voices rested inside the trunks surrounding her. People who had crossed mountains, rivers, and state lines. People who had started over. People who had lost homes, families, certainty, and direction. For decades, their stories had survived because one woman believed they deserved to be remembered. In the weeks that followed, Clara worked carefully. She cleaned documents one page at a time. She cataloged journals. She photographed fragile letters. Then she contacted the County Historical Society. At first, nobody believed the scale of what she had found. But when archivists, historians, and local volunteers arrived, their reactions told her everything. They moved through the collection with quiet amazement. Several descendants of families mentioned in the records were eventually located. One elderly man traveled nearly 3 hours after learning a journal written by his great-grandmother had survived. He sat at a table in the inn holding the worn notebook with trembling hands. Tears gathered in his eyes as he read words nobody in his family knew still existed. More people followed. Families, researchers, neighbors. The building that had stood silent for generations slowly filled with life again. Yet the greatest change happened inside Clara herself. All her life, she had carried the feeling that there was no place being kept for her. People left. Homes disappeared. Doors closed. She had spent years preserving the stories of strangers while quietly wondering where her own story belonged. Standing inside the restored common room one autumn evening, she finally understood the answer. Belonging was not something she had been waiting to receive. It was something she had built. The inn became more than a building. It became a living archive, a shelter for memory, a place where forgotten lives could continue speaking. Months later, on a golden afternoon, Clara sat at the old writing desk beside the upstairs window. The hills beyond the glass glowed beneath the setting sun. Downstairs, visitors moved softly through the rooms. Laughter drifted upward from the common room. Beside her rested a fresh notebook open to its first page. Clara picked up her pen and began recording another story. Not because she feared it would be forgotten, because she finally knew it mattered. Outside, the maple trees swayed gently in the evening light. Inside, for the first time in many years, Clara felt completely at home.